Good evening. It is good to see this number out. We are thankful that you are here. If you'll be opening up your Bibles to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 is where we are studying from. And last Wednesday night we began in the chapter and talked about another one of these signs. By the way, what is the two verses that you have to get? 20, 30, and 31. Chapter 20, verses 30 through 31 tells us what the book of John is all about. It's the purpose statement of the book. Many other signs truly as Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah, the Anointed One, and believing have life in His name. And so all of these signs have a deeper meaning. And last week, the sign was the feeding of the 5,000, most people call it. I call it the feeding of the 5,000 plus because it was 5,000 men, but there were, most likely women and children there as well. So, but all of that took place. We keep talking about how that sometimes, a lot of times in John, you've got the event, and then you've got a discussion about the event. And the discussion is going to tell us more about what the sign is all about, the feeding of the 5,000. But before we get there, we've got another sign that kind of interrupts the sign and the discussion about the sign in John chapter 6. And it's one of my favorite of the signs that we have. I need to put that up there on the screen, don't I? I haven't done that yet. It's one of my favorite signs that we have. Just because of the fact that it is, it's so, well, I had it up there, and there it goes. It's the one that we're going to talk about tonight because it's so beyond my realm of comprehension. Now, all of Jesus' signs kind of are, when you're raising the dead or healing the sick, or I've never seen anybody do anything like that at all. So it's a little bit, of course. Beyond our realm of comprehension to a certain degree, I suppose, but particularly when we're talking about the one we're going to talk about tonight, because, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and Superman with Christopher Reeve was on when I was a little boy. I thought Superman was it, and I'm tying towels around my neck, and I'm pretending I can fly, and I can... I'm strong, and I'm bulletproof, and I can run real fast, and all those kind of things. My brother liked Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk. We got to watch every Friday night. It was the Muppet Show, and then Lou Ferrigno as the Incredible Hulk, and then the Dukes of Hazzard, which weren't technically superheroes, but the way they could jump a river with that car and you'd see every axle break, and they'd still drive off. That was kind of a superpower, I guess. I love superheroes, love comic books. And then, of course, now my boys have grown up in the era of all the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And you think about these abilities that these heroes have that's beyond what we could even imagine doing. Well, it almost seems like something right out of a comic book to think that somebody could walk on water. In fact, I remember when Garrett was, I don't know what... Melody's not in here. I think Garrett was like 3 or 4 maybe when we went and saw The Incredibles. If y'all have seen that superhero movie from Disney, and Dash, the little boy, is running, and he gets to where there's the lake, and all of a sudden he closes his eyes and he looks up and he's running on the water. He's running so fast. And Garrett's like, that's amazing. And I'm like, Jesus did it first, And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is Jesus walking on the water. And there's so much about this that the Bible doesn't tell us, that leaves me just fascinated about it, that it's just beyond my realm of comprehension. And it's one of those that oftentimes when I read or study one of the accounts of it, that I start thinking in my mind, making a list of things I want to ask Jesus about when I get to see Him. And then I think, when I get there, when I see Him, I may not even, this may be the last thing on my mind, I don't know, but there's so many questions that I want to ask about it, and we'll talk about all of that in just a moment. But it is an interesting account. We mentioned last week that the feeding of the 5,000 plus is one of the few accounts that's in all 4 of the Gospels. This is in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and when we look at the other gospel writers' account of this, we get a little more detail than we do in John. And we'll talk about some of those in just a moment. But all of them have it right after the feeding of the 5,000. And so chronologically, it must have happened during this time. But what's really interesting to me about it, I think, is what happens at the end of the chapter, which really we disconnect with this sign, and we think about it more connecting with the feeding of the 5,000. But I'll point out in just a moment why I think that it's so important that it's connected with it. In any event, if you'll recall, after Jesus took the little boy's sack lunch, 2 itty-bitty tea-tiny fish, 5 little loaves of barley bread, and he feeds the 5,000. Says thank you to God for it. They start passing it out, and they pass it out, and they pass it out, and everybody eats all they wanted until the point that they're completely full. And then they start picking up the leftovers, and there's 12 baskets of leftovers. And then at the end of what we discussed online last week because of the ice storm, but it says at the end of let's see here, verse 14, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet." So they saw the sign, and what did the sign cause them to do? To believe. That's right. They believe that Jesus is the prophet, which makes us think again about the prophet Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses called down manna from heaven. Now Jesus has given them bread from heaven after he gave thanks to heaven for it. And they believe that he's the prophet. And Jesus realizes, verse 15, that they are wanting to make him king. And if you watched the class online last week, I talked a little bit about, I think, the significance of why he mentions it's just 5,000 men is because they want to make him king. 5,000 men would be an army. So you've got an army worth of men. We're going to make Jesus our king, and it's time for us to have a revolution. But Jesus withdraws up into the mountains, and he begins to pray. Now, John's account doesn't tell us this. In verse 16, it just says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. John's account doesn't tell us this, but the other gospel writers tell us that Jesus compelled or forced them, made them go. So Jesus puts them in a boat and sends them across the Sea of Galilee. And we'll pause for just a minute, and I want to talk a little bit about that, the boat and the Sea of Galilee, and a little bit about what's, give you a mental picture here. When you're thinking about a first century Galilean boat, don't think about a John boat, but on the other hand, don't think of like, Gilligan and the skipper. They were going on it was longer than a 3-hour tour they ended up on out on the Sea of Galilee, but a Galilean fishing boat, approximately 25, 26 feet long, and you can see its size in comparison to like a delivery truck or a school bus to kind of give you an idea of the size of that. And this graphic kind of shows you how that they would fish when they went out. They had the nets that they would cast that had the weights around it, and as it went down over the fish and they would start to pull it in, the weights would collect together and capture the fish within the net. We've talked about this before, but for the sake of those maybe that haven't been here when we have discussed it, here's a picture of the Sea of Galilee. And I've told you before, I guess to show how ignorant I was, but when I thought Sea of Galilee, I'm thinking sea. And the Sea of Galilee is almost the same size as Garrett Lake. If you've ever been over to Garrett Lake and fished Garrett Lake, it's just a big lake. And as you can see on the picture there, you can see all the way to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. It's not really that big. It's just a lake, really, even though we call it a sea. We got to go, and I know Johnny and Ron and Danny, when y'all went, you got to go out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee. We did it on Sunday. I'm not sure what day y'all went on out on the boat, but it was an interesting thing to go out on the boat, and while you're out on the boat, everywhere you look, you can see land. So it's not like, I've been deep sea fishing out in the Gulf of Mexico, and you get so far out you can't even see land, and that's, by the way, that's when I started getting really sick. But it's not like that. Everywhere you look, you can see land. And I took this picture because I don't know if you can tell those little dots there's ducks there, And then I look down, and in the water there's catfish in the Sea of Galilee, which I think is a cruel thing to think about, that they couldn't eat catfish, and there's all that catfish there. But I told Melody, I said, there's ducks here, and there's catfish. This really is the land of plenty. This is God's promised land, you know. But it's beautiful, but it's just not that big. And you're going, as we were going out, you would think this is about how maybe far they were off the coast as they're traveling, the trip that they took. We had a little Devo out there on the lake, and took some pictures. And like I said, everywhere you look, there's a mountain. Maybe that's the mountain that they're talking about in the text here. Over at Magdala a couple years ago, they've had such drought over there, the waters receded to the point that they're walking around on land that all used to be underneath the Sea of Galilee. And somebody stepped on something and said, "What's this?" Well, it was this fishing boat that they've dated back to the time of Jesus, over 2,000 years old. And of course, the mud that had encased it is what preserved it for all of these years, but it was a great find that they made, and so they've reconstructed it, and this is a graph that shows all the different kinds of wood that makes it up. The most of it is cedar wood, but then there's other little pieces of other kinds of trees. But this is where the dock at Magdala was, and all of these little communities around the lake, they had these little places where there would have been a dock that they found, because that was the way so many of these people in that area made their living, was by fishing. Now I've got up here, this is not the first nor the last miracle that Jesus is going to perform on the Sea of Galilee. He calms a storm that John doesn't record for us in a separate time that they're out on the water. Remember, Jesus is asleep, and there's a storm, and they wake him up, and he rebukes the sea and the wind. I've always thought was funny. It was like I'm taking a nap, and Garrett and Gordon Gannon were too loud playing, and I get up and I say, "Hush." And Jesus wakes up and looks at the wind and the waves and says, "Hush." And the waves and the wind obeyed Jesus better than Garrett Gordon Gannon ever obeyed me. But he walks on the water we're talking about tonight. It's also in Matthew and Mark. There's a miraculous catch of fish in Luke chapter 5 whenever Jesus calls Peter to be his disciple. And then a second miraculous catch that we'll get to at the end of John after Jesus' resurrection. But lots of events take place out on the Sea of Galilee that are significant for us, for sure. But Jesus puts them in the boat, and he says, "Go, and I'll catch up with you later." And I don't know what they thought, how Jesus would do that. He was somewhere, we're not exactly sure, but somewhere in a wilderness area, and there's some speculation of maybe to the west of Capernaum, or maybe to the east of Capernaum, or something of that nature. But he's not really going completely across the lake, kind of just clipping a little bit of a side of it. Maybe they thought he was going to walk around it, which would be a reasonable thing, because we're going to find out later on in John chapter 6 that all of this throng of people that Jesus had fed, they're going to come around, some on dry land, some on boats, and catch up with him. But they take off in the boat, and they're doing as Jesus has told them to. By the way, one of the things that I've always thought was very interesting of how many times in the gospel accounts that Jesus would come to the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, and they would get in a boat and they would cross over. And they'd come to another place and they'd get in a boat and they'd cross over. And I thought about, we don't know in any of those times whose boat it was they were on. There was somebody there providing a boat for Jesus. And there was a whole lot of people that's involved in ministry and the work of the church that their name you'll never know that they're involved, but they're there doing what they can do when they can do it. So Jesus puts them in a boat and sends them across. They do what Jesus says. When the evening comes, they get into this boat, verse 17, and they started across the sea to Capernaum. So we've talked about before, of course, Capernaum is Jesus' adopted hometown, and it's at almost the very center of the top, the northernmost portion of the Sea of Galilee. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Now, I don't know how many of you like to fish or hunt or be out on the lake, but if you've ever been on Reelfoot Lake fishing or duck hunting, the way that it is arranged because of the river and everything, it doesn't take much wind on Reelfoot Lake to make it really choppy and really wavy and really dangerous to be out on. The Sea of Galilee is surrounded by hills and mountains, but there are enough kind of little chutes and valleys that they say that when the wind's blowing just right, it kind of forces all of that wind into a narrow tunnel and really increases the activity that it has on the water out there. And maybe that's something natural like that is what has occurred here. Maybe this is a supernatural occurrence. The text doesn't really tell us. But the sea becomes rough. And it's becoming rough because there's this strong wind. And if you've ever been in one of those situations in a boat or a plane where there's storms and it gets really serious really quickly, and how especially when you're looking. Whenever we went on our honeymoon, we flew to Florida and went to Disney World for a week. It's the first time I'd ever flown, and it was pretty easy flight down there. On the way back, it was stormy and thunder and lightning and everything else, and we were in a smaller plane, and every now and again we'd be flying along, and all of a sudden it would just felt like it just dropped, 1,000 feet or whatever, and lightning, and they kept the seat belts on, and we're freshly married, so I'm trying to be very manly, And Melody, who had flown several times, she's getting a little scared, and I put my arm around her like it's okay, and the whole time I'm like, please, Lord, don't let me down, And I'm scared, but I don't want to. But I kept watching the stewardesses, and they're just walking around giving coffee like it's not. And I'm thinking, if they ever act like they're worried, that's when it's time to really get scared, Well, you've got some experienced fishermen on this boat in Peter and Andrew and James and John. And yet, even with their experience and their expertise, they're out on this water, and they're not going anywhere. Now, John, it's interesting when you read John's account, like this whole account basically is on the screen right now. John doesn't give us a whole lot of details, but for hours they're out there not going anywhere. Now, can you imagine, they're going into the wind, can you imagine how hard the wind must be blowing? You've got 12 guys that are rowing as hard as they can, and they're basically sitting still in the middle of that lake out there, or on the side of that lake out there. And so, because it's so rough and because it's blowing, they've rowed about 3 or 4 miles. That would be about halfway if we kind of know either side or which way that they're coming from. It would have probably been about halfway of where they were. So they're about halfway out. It's one of those you turn around and go back. Well, Jesus said go this way. We're halfway there. Just keep rowing harder and maybe we'll make it. And the harder they row, the longer they just stand or sit there in place. And then they saw Jesus, which is not unusual, except for the next line, walking on the water. Now, the other accounts will tell us that they saw, the word is the word for like a bright light. They saw something. They didn't recognize that it was Jesus. In fact, the other accounts tell us that when they saw Jesus walking out on the water, they thought he was a ghost. And so they're walking out. They're rowing their boat, and they're scared. The storm's blowing. I'm sure it's lightning and thunder, and the wind's howling. The waves are crashing. And then you look up and you see a ghost coming across the water. Well, now who are you going to call? I say, I thought some of you would get that eventually, But they become frightened. Now, they're already probably pretty scared, but now they're really frightened. You see a ghost. Now what do we do? But it's Jesus walking on the sea, and coming near the boat. Now, maybe I'm crazy. This is the way my mind works. I don't know about you. But I've got so many questions. When you're walking on water, is it like when you walk in mud or sand and it kind of squeezes up between your toes? I wonder that. Did he press down a little bit, or was it just like walking on ice for him? Was it stormy everywhere and right where he was perfectly calm like this floor? I don't know. If it's waves, is it like he's walking up and down hills, or is he walking through the waves? I don't know. I don't even know how it works, so I can't imagine how to explain. You know, there's lots of things, and I try to, as a preacher and teacher, you try to paint a mental image of this is the way this probably. I don't know where to start with how this looked, you know. It's one of those things you would see in a comic book that is so beyond the realm of imagination or possibility that I can't even fathom it. I don't know how many of you have seen the last episode. I was going to show it, but for some reason the internet was kind of slow, and so I was afraid to try it. But the last episode of The Chosen from season 3 that just released last night, the Jesus walking on the water, this scene is there. He feeds the 5,000, and then they're out on the boat, and here comes Jesus walking on the water. And when they first think it's a ghost, and they're scared to death, and one of them says, "Let's go nearer." And Andrew goes, "Are you crazy? You know, why would we go towards the ghost?" And then he says what he's going to say, "It's me." And then out of the clear blue, Thomas says, "How is this not the second most amazing thing how is this the second most amazing thing I've seen today?" Well, they just fed the 5,000, and now this. And it's just mind-blowing to think about. And so they think he's a ghost. They see Jesus walking on the water, coming near the boat, and they were, he tells us, frightened. Well, that may be the most understatement of the entire gospel. You're in a storm at sea, and a ghost is walking out towards you. They're frightened. But Jesus says to them, "It is I." Now, we don't translate it this way, but if you literally translated that phrase, "It is I," it's two words. I am. And what would be the significance of I am? It's God. When Moses sees that bush burning up on the mountainside while he's tending his father-in-law's sheep, and the bush is on fire, but it's not consumed, and he walks up there, and a voice comes out, and it's the angel of the Lord, and he says, "Take off your sandals, for the place that you're standing is holy ground." And he says, "I've got a job for you." And he begins to make excuses, and one of the excuses, well, what if they ask who sent me? I won't know who to tell them because I don't know your name. And the voice said, "You tell them, I am. I am that I am. You say that I am has sent you." Which is a weird thing. Let's be honest. If Gannon walked in the kitchen and looked at Melody and said, "I am," what would Melody's next words be? Huh? Yeah. Hey, what? I am what? I am thirsty. I am tired. What are you? It's not an incomplete sentence. There's a subject and a verb, but there needs to be something else added to it, right? You don't just walk in a room and say, "I am." Well, of course you am. You right there. You am what? It's a statement of being, but because of the burning bush, it becomes a statement of deity. And that's the way the Jewish people viewed it, was as a statement of deity. Later on in the Gospel of John, Jesus is going to use this exact phrase, "I am." And when they hear that, they're going to pick up stones to stone him because he's claiming to be God. And they know that. And it's blasphemy in their eyes. And for anyone to claim to be God, it would be blasphemy Unless what? Unless He am God, right? And He is. He says, I am. Do not be afraid. And so then they were glad to take Him into the boat. Now pause there, because other accounts tell us that something else happened. When Jesus said, I am, Peter said, Lord, if it's really you, you command me to come out. And Peter got to walk on water. But when Peter got out on the water, and again, it's one of those things, you love Peter because of how he's just out there. You never have to worry about who he was, what he thought, where he was at. But he gets out on the water, and he's walking on water. And he begins to look around at the wind and the waves, and he begins to fall. And Jesus grabs him, and they get in the boat. So they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Now, I don't know, the word that's used there, immediately, means immediately. But it could be that it just seemed like it was immediately. It could have been miraculous, and that just suddenly they were there on the other side. But however it was, that was the end of the problems. And of course, there's lots of parallels that we can draw. If you think about our storms in life that we have to deal with, it's interesting to think about, how this is a very preachable and teachable and applicable text for us to think about. When you think about the fact that whatever our storm in life that we have to face, and it could be health problems or relationship problems or financial problems or spiritual problems or whatever it is. But sometimes, we think about, maybe you've heard it said something like this, to this effect anyway, that God won't give you any more than you can handle. The Bible is full of people that God gave them way more than they could handle, so that they would understand that they can't do it on their own, that they need Him. And He's giving the disciples, He's sending them into, did Jesus know there was going to be a storm on that sea? Sure He did. Why would He send the disciples directly into a storm? Here in a few, yes, Ron. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He told us that the wind blew from the east across the Sea of Galilee every day, that you could count on it. And so Jesus and Peter and Andrew and James and John knew that too.
Mm-hmm.
When we were at Capernaum, the water was white capping.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably an everyday occurrence also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how bad was it with those fishermen where they're frightened out there? So why would Jesus send them into a storm like that? Well, He needs them to understand who He is, because after His death, burial, and resurrection, He's going to spend 40 days with them, and then He's going back to the throne. And what's He fixing to send these guys out into? A storm. Different kind of storm, but a storm. And it's also interesting, you read the other gospel accounts, John doesn't tell us this, but while they're out on that storm, Mark tells us that Jesus saw them. He's up on that mountain, and whether it's that He can just has a clear shot of them, or because He's God, He saw them, but He saw them. Does God know what we're going through? Yes, He does. And He came to them, and He's there with them. He didn't take away the storm necessarily, but He helps us get through the storm. Jesus calmed the storm at sea on another occasion, but He didn't tell us here that He calmed the storm. He said He got in the boat and they were at the other side. And He got them through it. And what I think is maybe the most interesting part about it, and why I think maybe it happened when it happened, is twofold. Number one, when they got done feeding the 5,000, how many baskets of leftovers were there? What did they do with those? You got, pardon? It didn't really say, but Jesus had them pick up the leftovers so none would go to waste, so I doubt they just tossed them to the birds, right? And I don't know how it happened. Maybe Andrew's carrying 4 and James is carrying 3 and you know, Judas is carrying 4 and nobody's carrying, you know. But you've got 12 baskets and you got 12 disciples. It seems reasonable to think that they all had a basket of leftovers. They pick up the basket of leftovers so that none go to waste, and Jesus says, get in the boat and go across, and they get in the boat. So I think it's pretty likely they get in the boat with their basket of leftovers, and they put it down on the bottom of that boat, and they sit down and they grab an oar and they start going. So the whole time they're out there on that sea, in that storm, in between their feet, they've got a reminder of who Jesus is, right? I think that's interesting. But what's really interesting is when they get to the other side, and we'll talk about this next week, when they get to the other side, all these people that they fed, they come around and they're wanting to find Jesus again, and they have this conversation about Jesus saying, you're seeing the signs and it's causing you to believe, but you're not really seeing the signs and understanding what they mean. You think that it means, what can we get out of this guy? He can be our king. He can throw out the Romans and we'll be a mighty nation here on this earth once again. And that's not what it's all about. But when Jesus has this conversation with them and he upsets them, at the end of chapter 6, here's a spoiler alert for you for next week, but at the end of chapter 6, the majority of them go home. They leave. And when you look at the end of chapter 6, flip over to the end of chapter 6, and notice the end of this conversation that Jesus has with his disciples when all of these people are walking away and leaving him. Verse 66, after this, many of the disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered him. Now what had happened to Simon out on the water? He walked with Jesus on the water. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. How did he know that Jesus had the words to eternal life? Because Jesus is, I am. He's God. And Peter saw that. All the disciples saw that. Peter saw that as he's walking out on that water, looking around at that wind and waves, the water going up between his toes as he steps. When he takes his eyes off Jesus, he begins to sink, and Jesus is the one that grabbed a hold of him and pulled him in the boat. So, I am is significant, and you'll hear people talk about the I am statements of the book of John, the 7 I am statements. There's a lot more than 7 actually, but there's the I am the good shepherd, I am the door, I am the bread of life, those kinds of things. But there's these other times where Jesus uses this terminology to help them realize I am God. And the walking on the water is one of those things that you have to sit back and say, now who can do that? Who has the power over nature? Who can command the water to hold me up and it's going to listen? Did you ever, when you were a kid, maybe y'all weren't as dumb as we were, did you ever, when you were a kid, like tie some floaties to your feet and try to walk on a pool or something? What, a pool or the floaties? Did anybody try that? No, I was just really dumb, I guess. I don't know. Guess how that worked out? Again, it's mind-blowing to think about. Even with anything we might try to create, can't do it. And it's another one of those signs. And it's interesting to think about because of the way that John records it for us. Jesus shows up, he gets in the boat, immediately they're at the other side. It's almost like he's talking about, they got in the car, they went down to E.W. James and got a loaf of bread and came home and made sandwiches, like it's no big deal. But as John writes this 60 years later, it's not, because how did he begin the entire book? In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Everything was created by Him. So I am is trying to show the disciples, I'm providing for you in the feeding of the 5,000 plus, I'm showing you who I am by the things that I'm doing, the signs that I'm showing, that He has power over nature itself, that He has power over creation, that the rules, the laws of nature don't apply to Him because He's God. All right, so if you'll read the rest of chapter 6, we probably won't get through the whole entirety of chapter 6 next week, but we'll work on it anyway. Read the rest of chapter 6, and we'll pick up in verse 22 next week. Before we're dismissed, we'll have just a few announcements that we want to make you aware of. Thank you, those of you that are online, as Gordon turns that off for us. Hope that you'll be able to be with us in person soon. We've got several of our number that are home sick, lots of illnesses that are going